In 2018, my hairdresser sent me a copy of The Primal Wound. She'd been telling me for a number of months that I really needed to read it and understand the concept, that the experiences that I had shared with her, she said, would be highlighted in the book. It took me a long time to open the book, but when I did, it was the first time I had really felt seen and validated. Every page I turned resonated with my own experience, which I had internalized. I'd never been given words or the permission to explore my experience previously. As a child, whilst I had spoken about my adoption with my parents, they had never actually gone into the psychology or the emotional impacts which had been left behind from the separation of myself and my biological mother. It was in reading the book, the section that really struck me was the one on night terrors, where Nancy Verrier explains that because adoptees internalise their trauma from the separation, that without words, a subconscious memory still shines through. For me, it did in night terrors. When I was about 8, I started experiencing these night terrors, and they were framed to me by my parents, which I had believed up until this point, that I would wake in the middle of the night and not know where I was. I wouldn't recognise them. They'd be sitting in my bedroom and I would look beyond them and not be comforted and keep screaming. It wasn't until I read the words in her book that I realised what these night terrors were, because I could remember waking and screaming, I want my mummy, I want my real mummy, I want to go home. My parents sent me for a brain scan. They thought I had a brain tumour. My trauma continued to go unrecognised until I read these words and I started to understand how deeply the separation had impacted me in every aspect of my life. But when I think back to that 8-year-old and what was going on at that time for me in my life, I can understand why the night terrors started. Earlier that year, on my special day, which was the celebration of the day I was adopted into my adoptive family, one of the neighbours said to me, "You know you're only being celebrated because you weren't wanted." I took that on board. Later in that year, the teacher, while studying families, asked the children in the room to put their hand up if they were adopted. So I did. That led to teasing in the playground. "You know you weren't wanted." It was the first time I started to understand what adoption actually meant. To me, I made sense of it. That if I was so wanted and chosen by my adoptive family, that first I had to be unwanted by someone else. The feelings of abandonment and rejection all surfaced. And then also the birth of my neighbour's son. We went to visit him in the hospital when he was a couple of hours old. It was the first time I'd ever been in a hospital nursery. And I remember looking through the window at the rows of babies lined up. And it made sense of the story that my mother had told me, that she'd come to the hospital and chosen me, that she had wanted a little girl and walked the rows of babies and picked me out. There's no wonder the night terrors started. it wasn't till years later in reunion that I also worked out that my brother was born that same year. So the connection to my mother, that primal connection, I'm sure it was felt. The primal wound and its concept in psychology, describing the deep, invisible trauma experienced when a baby is separated from their biological mother, is real. And it's gone unnoticed and unrecognised for far too long. Back when I was growing up, this trauma wasn't recognised. There were no words surrounding my experience. There was no recognition, and I carried my feelings deep inside through every stage of my life. It's impacted my relationships, my self-worth, my beliefs, and it's all been kept deeply hidden and buried inside because it wasn't recognised.